All right, we are continuing our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha, although we're well into Elisha being kind of the main prophet, well past Elijah at this point. We'll begin 2 Kings chapter 6 this morning. Now, before we get into chapter 6, maybe just kind of a thought, not really important to the text itself, but it's interesting to see how man has chosen to divide up the chapter breaks here, because we get a lot of really interesting and very different things going on in chapter 6 that then flows into chapter 7 in a way that I probably wouldn't have broken it up that way, but that's the way we have it. So, Monday morning quarterbacking over here, I guess. But we're, and this, maybe chapter 6 and part of chapter 7, or maybe all of chapter 7, kind of is a nice summation of a lot of what Elisha does as a prophet. We see some sort of minor, very small one-on-one things that he is doing for people, and then also doing really big things that really affects the entire kingdom as a whole. And I kind of want you to just keep that thought and that theme in your mind as we kind of get to the end of this study. We'll go through chapter 13 is my plan for this study, and kind of just think about that and why that's important, because I'll want to talk about that more as we get toward the end of the study. But I think this is kind of a nice place where we see this in all in one spot. We're not going to finish chapter 6 at all. I don't think that we will, but we'll certainly get as far as we can. So if someone would start reading for us 2 Kings chapter 6 verses 1 through 4, please. 1 through 4.
And the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, "See now, the place where we dwell with you is too small for us. Please let us go to the Jordan, and let every man take a beam from there, and let us make there a place where we may dwell." So he answered, "Go." Then one said, "Please consent to go with your servants." And he answered, "I will go." So he went with them. When they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. And he cried out and said, "Alas, master, for it was bald."
You're going past just through 4. You're all right though. I'm just going to talk about through 4. Jeff is trying to be an overachiever here. It's all right. So, because I wanted to stop there to talk about sort of the setup of what's about to happen before we get into the actual miraculous occurrence here. So, looking at verses 1 through 4 specifically, we have depending on your translation, the company of prophets or the sons of the prophets. They go to Elijah, and what do they tell him? What is the issue that they have? What's too small? Yeah, the dwelling, their meeting place, depending on your translation. And they say it's too small. And this seems like such a minor thing, but there's really some interesting thoughts that we can pull out of this. Is obviously the place where they have been meeting has not gotten smaller over time. That's not how that works. So in my mind, this group of prophets, is it getting bigger? Is it getting to the point where they're gaining more and more prophets, and now they don't have enough space for everybody? That's kind of what I have in my mind. I don't think it's sort of this, idea of discontent. Well, we've been meeting in this place, and it's just not great, and we want something better because we deserve it because we're prophets of God. Let's have something nicer. I don't see any indication that this is what's going on, especially given Elisha's reaction to it. As we see. This is not something of luxury they're looking for. It seems to be a practical matter. We just can't all fit in here. And so, to me, this should be something that's very encouraging that's going on. This place is too small. To me, indicates that they have more men, more people who have joined the ranks of the company of prophets, which is a good thing. We constantly see problems in Israel, people not being convinced of things, especially the kings, things not really changing after a lot of the things Elijah did. But this might be kind of a small victory that's been happening in the background that we just haven't really looked at or seen or have written specifically for us. something good is happening here. And this is a good story right here. This is a things are going well story as far as that goes. Now that is a little bit of supposition, but I can't think of a reason why it would be too small otherwise. So I guess I'm assuming a few things here, but in my mind that makes the most sense. So that's what I'm going with. If anyone has a different thought on that, I'm open and listening about it.
If you want to wait to the end of your talk.
Okay, all right. I'll prepare in my mind as we get there. So their plan is to address this is go to the Jordan River, the Jordan, and there we can get, in your translations will say pole or log or beam. I think we're talking about lumber here. They need material to build it so they can have a new place to meet. And the question can easily become, well, why go there? Of all places, they obviously aren't there now. They have to go there. We're not exactly sure where they are when this conversation happens, but they have to go to the Jordan to do this. Why can't they do it where they already are? And there may be a few reasons, but one of the reasons may be there may not be any other mature trees around for them to do that with. Remember, there has been droughts, there have been famines that we've constantly been talking about. There's going to be more. The only place where you can have a mature tree is where there's been a consistent source of water. And the Jordan River is going to be one of those few places. So in my mind, this is another practical matter. They're going to the Jordan because that's the place where you can get material to build at this point. So that's where they're going, why they're going there. And one additional thing, up to this point, they ask Elisha to come with them, and he does. So again, this shows that he is supportive of this idea. It's not these prophets are, they're in this mood of discontentment and they want something better. It's a practical matter, and Elisha is saying, yes, this is a good thing to do. So kind of further cements that point. I'll go to you, Jeff, because I'm done with my points, and you have dibs.
Well, just, because people have put, human beings have sometimes put too much emphasis on the building, made it the object of their work. The building is somewhat of a quagmire for churches sometimes to deal with. I think your comments are good. It needs to be of a practical nature. This building is a place to meet, but that doesn't mean it's unimportant. It is important where we meet and to make it in a way that is most conducive to our meeting. So we have a building, it is ours. If we can afford to do that, that's better because we can guarantee its availability whenever we need it. It is a place that should not be over-adorned. You can do that, obviously, but it should be a place that could be useful. It shouldn't be a place where we sit on logs and tremble because we don't use any heat. We should make it something that people are normally accustomed to in their life within reason.
Mm-hmm.
So we have padded seats and things like that. Just about every seat we sit in life is that way. And we don't want things to be distracting. We want people to be able to focus and not be thinking, man, these seats are hard. And certainly there was a time when that was normal.
Mm-hmm.
And that was fine then, but things have changed a little bit now. So we're trying to be mindful of those kinds of things without expending excessive funds. You can wrap up millions of dollars in a building, and if you have a large enough congregation you need that, you can justify that. But obviously, that's not what we're trying to do. This building belongs to God. It does not belong to the congregation. It was purchased from funds from the treasury, or it was, in our case, it was given to us, but it was refurbished with funds. So it belongs to the Lord. And so it's not a community building. It's not for us to have, whatever activities that we want to have. And so this helps us understand that whatever we use in serving God is important, and we need to use it in a way that honors Him, that doesn't just satisfy the desires of the flesh. And so and there are many ways in which you can do that. You can satisfy the desires of mankind. So those are important things to remember when we come together. This is a practical place, a useful place. It helps us. If there are ways that we can improve it, tradition should not keep us from doing that. things I think that are important. A lot of times we don't talk about them because the building's not the most important thing. But that doesn't make it unimportant.
Sure, and easily we can get in. I mean, it's not a bad comparison, but it easily can become its own kind of study here and its own topic. And we've done that before, discussing that. And but because the comparison is good, I think it's worth talking about. Practicality should be the main driver, and it is so easy to go to either extreme where we're going to have it. These huge Gothic cathedrals that have just decor that are much of it quite unnecessary for what needs to be done. And then you have the other extreme where it's just, all we need is four walls and a cross, as I think Calvin said, which is not necessarily a bad idea, but also you need to make sure that people can actually be in there and be in somewhat livable conditions for the time. That can be a whole nother discussion in itself. But again, I think that the point here in chapter 6 is that these prophets are not looking for earthly luxury here. It's like, oh, this place is just too small. We're just tired of it. I think that what we should take from that is that company, that group of prophets has been growing. It doesn't say that specifically, but I think that is the implication here. And so this is a good news sort of story here. And I guess we're sort of an example of that. When we moved to this building, the one we were at, things were getting a little bit small at times. That parking lot get a little full, and it wasn't something that we owned. And so for practicality, being here is a little bit better. It wasn't really a luxury that we were looking for, just the practicality part. So, again, I think Elisha's reaction to these men, requesting this, kind of again shows that this is not a bad thing that they're asking for. This is a good thing, and so he goes along with them to do it. Any other comments, thoughts about up through verse 4? Okay, if I get someone to read for us verses, we're going to reread verse 5, and though Jeff already read it. Verses 5 through 7, please. 5 through 7. Okay, so very short few verses here, but a miraculous thing has happened. Well, we're going to talk about the properties of all of this. So we're told that one of these guys was using an axe to cut down some lumber, cut a tree or what have you, and the axe head comes off. So I assume it's a wooden handle. It's what we typically have. You have either a wood or metal handle. But the head is metal, and he's using it. The axe head pops off of it, lands in the water, it's kind of hard to get when it's in the water. So we learned a couple important details about this axe. First of all, it was made of iron. Ironworks were not uncommon by this time, but still would have had some significant value. It's not like anyone could pick up a chunk of iron and make it into whatever they wanted. You did need specialized artisans who knew what they were doing. I kind of compare it to like iPhones are really common. Everyone seems to have one, but they have some value because only certain people really know how to make them or have the ability to. So a common thing, but still of value. You remember maybe early on in Israel's history in the Promised Land, it talks about during the reign of King Saul, whenever they needed their iron to be sharpened or have something worked on, they had to go to the Philistines because the Philistines were the ones who had the ironworks. And there's a really interesting kind of historical thing going on there where the Philistines brought iron kind of to that region of the world, and everyone eventually adopted it also. It wasn't monopolized completely by them forever, but we're kind of the ones that introduced it. And he says about this axe that it was not his, it was borrowed. And I think this is probably the most important detail about it. Because if you go back into the old law, there's a lot of rules and regulations in the old law about the terms and conditions of borrowing things, lending things, how ownership works. You can just drown in it. A lot of it is about these kinds of things. So I didn't find anything specifically about axes. So, I don't have any verse for that, but there are similar verses that would probably give us a good idea of what would be expected in a case like this. So in Exodus chapter 22, verse 14, I'm going to use this kind of as a comparison and as we can kind of talk about it. Exodus chapter 22, verse 14 says, if anyone borrows an animal from their neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, they must make restitution. So I think this might be an interesting comparison. Yes, the axe is on an animal. Obviously, we know that. But we have a similar case here where it is damaged/lost while the owner is not around. So I think it would be expected in this situation that this company of prophets would be expected to replace this lost axe head and give it to the owner. Now, since they are borrowing this axe in the first place, my assumption is they don't have a lot of money to do this. They didn't pay someone to go make this new meeting place for them, and they're doing it themselves. So, they're doing all the labor. They're covering that cost themselves. They had to borrow an axe because they didn't have one. If you remember back to 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, where it talks about the widow of the man who was of the company of prophets or the sons of the prophets, they were in a great amount of debt, and she was about to lose her 2 sons to be sold into slavery because of it. We've talked about this story already. So my assumption here is that he's borrowed this axe because they don't have one, but they need one, and now he's lost the axe head. They're going to have to make the restitution for it, but they don't have the means to do that either. I think these are not men who really have the means to do this. Again, ironwork's not uncommon, but also not exactly cheap. A quality iron head of iron or an axe head of iron would be of some value. So I think this is the concern here, that they've lost something that he has no way to replace it. I think is kind of the worry here. Not that, lost something, because, I could just go down to the hardware store and get a new one and it'll be fine. I don't think they're able to replace it. And that is why this man is crying out and says, oh no, something really bad has happened. So I think that's kind of what's going on. Any thoughts about the axe or the borrowing, anything like that? I kind of wanted to break that down a little bit. Okay, all right. So Elisha responds to this distress about the axe head, and he says, where did it fall? And they show him the place where it went. He breaks off a stick, he throws it there, and the axe head floats to the surface, and they're able to recover it from the surface of the water. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about the properties of iron, typically does not float in water. Now, we could talk about, the Navy, they have these big metal ships and they float. Well, that's a whole thing about buoyancy, and we are not going to get into all that. Axe heads don't float. They are not designed for that. They are not that kind of material. That's not how that works. So here is a miraculous thing. And again, we can look at this and say, well, this is kind of a really minor thing. This is not that important. But we can think about, this kind of is important because these prophets are trying to have a place where they can meet because their numbers are growing. They need this axe head. They don't have the means to replace it. So even though this seems like such a small thing, it might have big implications later down the road. We don't want to have another situation where, a man's children are being sold off because he couldn't replace an axe head. That shouldn't be going on. So this seems like such a small one-on-one thing, but it does have rippling effects. And I've run into this situation before, not with an axe head, but with other tools. I don't know if any of you have had this situation. When one of my sisters was getting married, my grandparents, their property had a small island on it where the river divided and came back, and it's tradition to get married on that island. My parents got married on it. Both my sisters got married on it. I didn't. But a lot of people in our family have. And there's a little bridge that they have that connects from, across the river. And me and my cousin were charged with, fixing some of the planks and replacing them. And so we had, like a few tools and, some nuts and bolts that we were replacing the lining with. And I can't tell you how many things we dropped in that river as we were working on that bridge. We threw as many sticks in as we could, but none of them floated up afterwards. So there's nothing scientific here about Elisha taking a stick and throwing it in the water and that causing iron to float. That's not how that works. This is a miraculous thing. Why he did this specific thing to make it happen, it's not explained to us, but it is clearly miraculous. You can drop in as many iron heads into a river as you want. No amount of sticks is going to get it out. That's not how that works. So again, this is a miraculous thing. So again, a small thing, a very kind of personal one-on-one thing, but it does have ripple effects for the other people who are in the company of prophets and for the work that they would be able to do in Israel. So this seems like a really minor thing, but it's a really interesting story and would have some bigger implications. But that is the end of the story about the axe head. Any comments, thoughts, questions about this section of chapter 6? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
This reminds us that no issue is too small for God to take interest in it. And I'm guilty of this a lot. I think that this is a matter that I don't need to bother God with it. I can take care of this. And it's not that I won't take care of it, but we need to include God in our plans. He may have plans to help us. And we're talking providence here, not necessarily miracles, but still, providence is the act of God just as much as a miracle is
Sure.
the act of God. And this demonstrates that a miracle is the hand of God, whether it's big or small. I mean, whether you're parting the Red Sea or whether you're making an axe head float. That seems like if you have the ability, the axe head seems like a small thing.
In comparison, yeah.
In comparison. But it's the act of God nonetheless, and a providential act of God is from God as well, and even little bitty matters. So the point I'm trying to get at is not that we ask God to fix everything, but we just include God in our plans everywhere, every day, all the time, almost like a stream of consciousness. We are communicating to God, and we're just including him in our life, in our actions, every little thing. And you would be surprised. We may not ever know because it's a providence, but God will help us. God will, even sometimes in little things, God will turn a little thing into a big thing sometimes. So this just a reminder. It seems like an insignificant story,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
I think it's there for this reason, so that we can include God even in the small things of our life.
And it's not like God doesn't know. Like if we didn't pray for, God to help us with something, it's not like he wouldn't know that something, is bothering us or stressing us out, like say it's a small thing at work. But like you said, we should be going to God for the little things too. Maybe we might feel embarrassed about that. Like, like this really shouldn't be a problem. But if it's a problem, we need to talk to God about it. We shouldn't think that it's not important enough for God or that, it's, something like that. We need to include God. And we do that with other things we probably don't even think about when we ask, if we're sitting at a meal and we pray for the food and we pray that God ask him to have it be nourishing to our bodies. It's something like that. Well, scientifically, if you're eating good food, that's how it's going to work anyways. But is that still a good thing to pray for? Well, yes. Like, obviously, we want to show God, our thankfulness and knowing that, the only reason this food is going to be good for me is because God made it so, whether it's miraculous, which is not typically going to be the case unless someone is serving you some poison soup or something, I don't know. But, God made the properties of that food to act that way, and we should be thankful for that as well. So, it can definitely go both ways on that. Any other thoughts on this first part of the 6th chapter here? Okay. We're going to go away from the happy story now. The thing here about chapter 6 is the stories as we go through and get progressively darker and more distressing. So now we're going to talk about war, as one does. Someone read for us, let's see, verses 8 through 14, please. 8 through 14.
Thus he warned him and was watching and watchful there, not just once or twice. Therefore the
him, saying, surely he is in Dothan. Therefore he sent his horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city.
Okay. Thank you. So, like I said, we're going on a totally different new topic here, and starting in verse 8. We start here with the king of Syria, or Aram, depending on your translation. And guess what he's doing again? Who's he at war with? Israel. This is, again, a common thing. These nations do not get along during this time. And who would be, it doesn't tell us here, but does anyone remember who would be the king of Syria / Aram at this time? Still Ben-Hadad. I mean, he's been around for a while, hasn't he? Yeah, he's probably getting up in age there. He's going to come to his end pretty soon. We're not too far from that. We're a couple chapters removed from that. But it's still Ben-Hadad, as far as my understanding is. And he's doing his typical thing, making war with Israel here. And he says, I'm going to set up camp over here. And he kind of gets intercepted by Elisha in a way. The Lord is revealing to Elisha where the armies of Aram are going to camp, and he warns the king of Israel about it. Who would be the king of Israel at this point? Should be Joram still, is my understanding. Joram would be in charge of Israel here. Again, they're not giving us names, but these are the kings at the time. We've talked about them up to this point. And so he warns them, like, hey, there's the Arameans are going to set up camp here. You'll watch out for that. And he's able to confirm that that's the case. And this happened multiple times. Again and again, Elisha is able to receive from the Lord where the camp of the Arameans is going to be, and he's able to warn the king of Israel about it. And verse 11, the king of Aram, he starts to suspect something because, one time is a coincidence, but he's noticing a pattern here because this keeps happening. And he thinks, one of my officers is a spy. He's turned to the king of Israel. He's been bribed. Something's been happening. And he summons all his officials and he demands, who is it? I want to know who the mole is. Who's the snitch here? And who is it? Right, yeah, it's God. It's none of them. They say, well, it's not any of us. It's this prophet, Elisha, and they say his name specifically. It's the prophet Elisha, verse 12, who is in Israel, who, and I love the way this is written, he tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. How they know that to that degree, I mean, I'm sure that's possibly true. How they would know that, I'm not exactly clear on, but I think an interesting thing to think about is who among them might know a little bit about Elisha? So we talked about Naaman last chapter, who was a general. He was the chief commander of the armies of Aram. Now, it doesn't say his name here, and so I can't necessarily assume that he is with these officials, but that's not a far stretch to think that perhaps Naaman, whether he's here or has told other commanding officials about Elisha and the Lord and what he can do, there may be some influence that Naaman has brought back here so that they know these things. Otherwise, how would they know about Elisha? How would they know what he could do? How would they know that these things progress or transpire in this way, or even have the ability to? They didn't seem to have that understanding before Naaman went down there. At least as far as we know. Again, we're not told everything. But I suspect Naaman may have a little something to do with this conversation that's going on. So, again, not named, but might be there. We don't know for sure. But the king of Aram takes this information seriously. He's not blowing this off and saying, you guys are ridiculous. You're all trying to cover for yourselves. He takes this seriously and says, find out where he is. I want to send men to go and capture him. And they find out where he is. He's in Dothan. Now, Dothan is not a hugely significant city. We see it a couple times in the Bible. Not very often. It's not like Samaria or Jezreel or some very prominent city like that. So he says, okay, I know where he is. Verse 14, he sends his horses and chariots in a strong force there. And during the night, they surround the city. And again, this is not like a hugely prominent city. In my mind, I don't imagine huge defensive barriers, a huge garrison defending it. I think this is going to be a pretty helpless city against the forces of Syria or Aram, depending on translation. So that's sort of the setup as we start this story. Any thoughts about this setup, anything that we've talked about so far up through verse 14?
This is a reminder of how God sees everything. And it's kind of funny that way, because in our minds it's absurd, because I guess, in their defense, they don't know, but, when I was a kid in elementary school and I'd get a paddling at school, when I came home, I'd get another whooping. And I always wonder how in the world my parents found out that I got a whooping at school. And just wasn't thinking. And all the time, our kids do this too. They're sitting there playing in the room with us as if they don't know we're there. And then one smacks the other, and you think, what in the world do you think is going on here? It's human nature to be focused on my little details and forget the bigger picture. It's most wise for us to remember the biggest picture, and that is God sees everything. And we need to live our lives in that way. Now, this is not like the eye of, what is it, Sauron? In the oh, no, I've gone blank on the movie series. But anyway, what's the eye in
Oh, you're talking about Lord of the Rings, Sauron?
yeah, the Sauron.
Sauron, okay.
It's not like that. He's evil. This is a loving, benevolent God. He wants what's best for us. But he ain't gonna let us get out of line. Not to an excessive point. And he's gonna see everything and fix everything one day. But just a reminder that God sees everything.
I was not expecting a Lord of the Rings reference out of Jeff. I was thinking maybe Casey would have done that to me, but
Well, I couldn't remember the movie name.
well, you were close enough. We got there. Any other thoughts, comments on this section? Okay, I think we can get a little bit farther. We got a few more minutes. Someone read for us. Excuse me. Verses 15 through 18. 15 through 18.
When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. "O my lord, what shall we do?" the servant asked. "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes so he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Strike these people with blindness." So he struck them with blindness, as Elisha had asked.
Okay. So we have some interesting things to talk about here. So they get up in the morning, and they see, yep, here's this army that, the previous verse told us by night they had surrounded the city. And indeed they see it. They see this army. And it says the servant of the man of God, so I assume the man of God here is talking about Elisha. He says, what are we going to do? Now, that's not a ridiculous question, because this looks like a not great situation to be in all of a sudden. But I want to talk about the servant for a second here that we're introduced in this verse, in verse 15. Now, if you remember the previous chapters, Elisha had a servant named Gehazi, who we've talked about a few times. And at the end of chapter 5, where we have the story of Naaman, he's inflicted with leprosy because of his greed to try to get something from Naaman out of the whole interaction. And he flees from the presence of Elisha. Now, he's going to come back in a later chapter. I do not think that this is Gehazi here in verse 15. Now, it doesn't say, we're not told exactly. My impression, though, is that Gehazi and Elisha don't have that relationship anymore post chapter 5. I can't prove that for sure 100%, but in my own opinion, the way I understand it, this is probably a different person than Gehazi. I don't think this is him anymore. Again, not 100% sure, but that's the way I kind of assume that this is going on. So this is a different person who may not have seen or been around all the things that Elisha has done up to this point. So maybe this is just kind of his ignorance, not really knowing what Elisha and God can do. But Elisha's going to show him. And he says, don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And in verse 17, he praises God. not to like do anything grand, but to open his eyes, as if what he's about to see has already been there. And when this happens, when the Lord opens the servant's eyes, he sees the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around. I don't really know how this works. Could everyone else see it and just not the servant? Or was this something that Elisha could see because God had allowed him to see it, and then he allows the servant to see it? I think probably the latter. That's my opinion. I don't really know, but it's a really interesting thing that the servant is able to witness. And I assume that too, because when we get into verse 18 here, it says the enemy is coming toward them. So I don't think they would come toward him if they were seeing, these huge chariots of fire all around. I think they would be kind of spooked and trying to find their way out of there. So they're coming toward them, and Elisha prays to God again, and he says, strike them with blindness, and it happens. It's very hard to fight a war or a battle when you're blind. It's hard to see your enemy a little bit, especially if you're driving a chariot. That could be really dangerous, not seeing where you're going. So this is kind of a problem for the army of the Arameans. They're not going to be able to fight or to take the city or take Elisha in any way, because now they're all blind. And again, we're not given a number specifically about how many men are here, but when I see like the description back in verse 14, when it says they send horses, they send chariots, they send a strong force, I don't think this is some small detachment. I think this is a good-sized army. I'm going to assume at least in the hundreds, maybe thousands. I'm not sure exactly. But it's not just like a little gang of guys, 12 or 15 or something. I think we're talking probably at least in the hundreds here. That would be my guess. Now, is this the only time that God has done something like this, where he's had someone get stricken with blindness? The answer is no. It's not a trick question. This actually happens frequently. If you remember to Sodom and Gomorrah, when Lot is being rescued by the angels of God, they strike the men of the city with blindness. Saul, later becoming Paul, when he's on his way to the road to Damascus, the Lord appears before him and he's struck with blindness for a time. This is an interesting thing and a sort of a tool, if you think about it in a way, that God uses. Usually this is done on a temporary basis. Paul regained his sight later when he converted. You have, the men of the city of Sodom and Gomorrah probably didn't really matter. They all died. But these men are not going to be blind forever. They're going to regain their sight later on. We're probably not going to get to that part. Probably going to stop about here. But this is something that God uses. And blindness, the characteristic, it becomes pretty obvious when someone is not able to see. Especially if this is like a sudden, not an overtime thing, but like suddenly they don't, they can't see where they're going. They're doing this. They're trying to figure out where they're at. They're moving funny. They don't know where to look. They don't respond to things because they don't have the sight to see it. God is using this as a tool here as much as he uses it in other places, because being blind was, you were fully dependent on other people in this time if you were blind. We have technologies and aids now that will help many blind people to live independently. But in these times, it was very hard to live with any sort of means independently when you're blind. That's why, in the New Testament, when there were blind men and they were healed, they were usually begging. They were dependent on family. So we'll have to come back to this because I won't be able to finish this thought. But and we'll actually talk about it a little bit later in this chapter too. This inflicting of blindness, not only is it effective, but it's being used here as a tool. And I think there are some interesting comparisons that we can make. So we're gonna stop there. We're out of time. We'll continue verse 19 onward. Not next week. Next week I'm going to be gone. Buddy's going to cover my class. Next week he has said he's got a one-off short class that he's going to do for just that week. And so the following week, when we return, so 2 weeks from now, we'll start in verse 19 and we'll continue on through the chapter and onward. So we'll stop there. If you haven't already read the rest of this chapter, go ahead and read it. Maybe start chapter 7 as well, as it kind of continues the story. And we'll continue this study in 2 weeks. So maybe not the best place to stop, but that's all that time will allow. So we'll stop there, and we'll continue on in 2 weeks.